factors that affect how well timeout works. They involve whether or not you use verbal explanations, warnings, the length of timeout, what we call backup contingencies, the schedule for using timeout, a release criteria signaling the end of timeout, and the way in which you collect data. And we'll briefly talk about each of these. Be very careful with verbal explanations. If you're going to use timeout, have a very clear statement that you deliver to the student that explains what the person did and then tells the person he or she's going into timeout. Do not get into long explanations about why. Don't get into arguments about whether or not the person's going into timeout. You want to minimize the amount of interaction you're having with the student at this point in time so as not to inadvertently reinforce any kind of problem behavior. Warnings can be used effectively with timeout. With some students, I like to use warnings as part of any kind of behavior intervention because I found that students learn more quickly if they get to correct their behavior and make changes. It's a way of giving the student more responsibility for his or her behavior. If you're going to use warnings, though, give just one warning. And usually it's, I like to phrase it in terms of choice. Like, you need to decide if are you going to continue to do this? This is going to happen. Or you can make this choice. Put it back on the student. Give the student some responsibility. Be prepared to follow through if the student does not make the right choice. Extremely important here. Do not give multiple warnings. If you give a student multiple warnings, what you're essentially teaching the student to do is to ignore you. Give one warning and then give the student a brief period of time to make a choice, and then follow through. Timeout is most effective if it's very brief. If it doesn't work for a fairly short period of time, increasing the amount of time timeout is in effect is very unlikely to make it more successful. Usually with very young kids, short periods of 1 to 2 minutes is good. With elementary age kids, 5 to 10 minutes. With older kids, like high school age kids, I don't think timeout's an effective intervention. Always plan for what you're going to do if the student escalates. So have a plan in place. If you're going to use something like exclusionary timeout and you think it's very likely that the student is going to resist going to the timeout area, plan for how you're going to deal with that. Don't be surprised when it happens if you think it's likely to happen. Have a plan for dealing with escalations in behavior, almost always. Timeout, like other kinds of punishment interventions, should be used every single time the behavior occurs. The exception here would be if you decide you're going to use a warning and you give the student a chance to correct his or her behavior. Reinforcement is more effective if you do it intermittently. This is not true with punishment procedures. Intermittent punishment encourages risk-taking behavior. Think about the fact that we all speed, even though there's a pretty stiff punishment for breaking the law. We do it because we can do it many times without getting caught, and it encourages risk-taking behaviors. You can actually use fairly mild punishers, and if they're used effectively, they have more of an influence on behavior than very severe punishers used intermittently. If you don't think this is true, then just look at your own behavior. We do a lot of stuff that could carry a pretty heavy penalty because we think it's likely we're not going to get caught. Fairly minor things if we get caught every time, and then we change our behavior. If you're going to use a timeout procedure, decide on a criteria for the student getting out of timeout. For example, you might decide that you want the student to be quiet for at least 30 seconds. And if the student's disruptive, then you might add more time to it at the end, up until a certain point. If you see, I'm just thinking of a kid that I worked with years ago, a kid with emotional behavioral disorders. We were using a timeout, isolation timeout. These were kids with very severe aggressive behavior. This one particular kid would go, like, I think timeout was 3 minutes. At the end of 3 minutes, he would start hurling himself at the door and screaming, and it would add more time to his timeout. And he knew that he had to be quiet for 30 seconds to be released from timeout. And you could almost set your watch by it. It would be about 25 seconds, and then he would start screaming again. And then he'd get quiet, and then about 26 seconds later, he would like slam himself against the door. He was trying to extend time out because he was using it to escape doing math in the afternoon. If you see a kid using that kind of behavior, it's a pretty dead giveaway that your time out is actually reinforcing a problem behavior. As with all interventions, you need to collect adequate data to make sure that your intervention is actually working. With timeout procedures, this is actually part of the law. You have to collect meticulous data on how often you use timeout. What was the behavior that precipitated it? What time did the person go into timeout? What time did the person leave timeout? The bottom line is you have to make a determination if the behavior is actually decreasing. If it's not decreasing, then the intervention is not being effective. Timeout is one of those interventions that people will continue to use even if the data shows it is having no effect on the behavior. I've actually seen people continue to use it when it was clear the behavior was getting worse. The reason is timeout is a negative reinforcer for people who are working with a difficult kid. If you're working with a very difficult kid and struggling, and then you're putting the person in timeout, you've got a period of time that that person isn't bothering you possibly. So be very careful with it. As with anything else, it's not going to work by itself. It's overused as interventions go. It's often used when it's not the intervention of choice. It's almost always better to use something else. There are times when it is appropriate. Just be very careful about using it. Remember, we have positive and negative punishment. Positive punishment means that we're applying something, and it's usually something aversive, after a behavior occurs, and it decreases that behavior over time. In other words, the person learns, every time I do this, something I really don't like is going to happen, so I'm going to do it less. Negative punishment is when you're removing something contingent on a behavior, and it decreases behavior over time. In this case, it's something the person would rather not get rid of. So they're going to do that behavior less to avoid having something they value taken away, like computer time or recess time or a favorite toy. Response cost is a form of negative punishment. It's when you have fines for problem behavior. People will often use it in conjunction with a point system or token system. So kids will earn points or tokens for one behavior and then lose points and tokens for a different behavior. There's nothing evil about a response cost system. It's a problem when it's used too much. And it's really a problem if it's the only form of a system. I've been into a number of classrooms when the teacher's explaining how their point system works, and it was something like this. Every morning kids come in and they get 100 points. Every time they have some kind of problem, I'm going to take points away. Their goal is to keep as many points by the end of the day. Well, the problem with this it is negative punishment. Consider, what is it negative punishment does? It decreases behavior. If your goal is to increase appropriate behavior, negative punishment is not going to do it. So a response cost system is not going to effectively increase the behaviors you want to see. It might be part of a system. Reserve it for very severe problem behaviors. If you overuse it, it's simply going to undermine the value of your reinforcement system. If you are going to use response cost as part of an intervention, use it with natural consequences. In other words, the consequence should make sense given the behavior. For example, if a student has free time that he or she can do something, it's a choice, but the student doesn't finish work, it makes sense to say, if you haven't finished your work, you can't spend time on the computer. So make a choice. Use this time to finish your work, or you're going to have to finish your work later at the time that you would be able to use the computer. That's a form of response cost, but you're giving the student a choice. It's a natural consequence. You can also use it with a group contingency sometimes. So I've done things when the group would work towards points, but then if there was some serious problem behavior, the group would lose points. So you can use peer pressure as a way to help influence behavior change as well. Don't get carried away with response costs is the key. If you're going to use it, have very clear rules for when it's going to be used. Students should be aware what fines or penalties are going to be tied to certain behaviors. And to use it, of course, you've got to have some kind of effective reinforcement system in place. Students need to value something they're earning. You would want that to be the case anyway. Be sure that the fines or penalties associated with the response cost system are not real excessive. You want to avoid students going in the hole or owing more points than they actually have. I've seen this happen with kids. So, in other words, they might have a perfect afternoon just to be back at 0. That's going to really undermine the effectiveness of any kind of reinforcement system. It also works better if you're using things like points rather than tokens or things that you have to take away from a student. It can avoid situations of having to ask someone to give something up. So just to summarize, you can use response cost only if you've tried positive procedures by themselves and they haven't been effective, and you're using it as part of some kind of positive intervention. Use it when students have access to reinforcers that are effective. In other words, you're using reinforcers that matter to the students, and these are things students are willing to work for. You've explained the rules for fines very carefully to students, and they understand it. You've explained it in a way they can understand it. Visual cues help as well to show kids what kinds of fines are being employed. Decide how big fines are going to be and make sure they're not excessive and you avoid students going in the hole. Make sure the reinforcer is actually something you can remove without causing more problems than it's worth. And make sure that it's part of a positive reinforcement or a positive behavior support plan that has a lot of components. Only use it when you're teaching appropriate behavior and you're reinforcing appropriate behavior.